Great. So welcome, everybody. It's very excited to have you here. My name is Peter Hammer. I'm the A. Alfred Taubman Professor of Law and Director of the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights at Wayne State Law School. Welcome to Wayne Law's Legal Briefs, and thank you for all attending. Our alumni are incredibly important to our community, and it's very exciting for you to join us and to continue building and strengthening the Wayne Law community. A couple of housekeeping items before we go to an introduction. I'd encourage everybody to introduce themselves in the chat box so everybody gets a sense of who else is here as we get started. Everyone will remain muted throughout the presentation that Professor Jefferson-Jones will be giving. If you have questions during that period, simply type them in the chat box. Once we reconvene as a group in a Q&A mode, you can either type in the chat box if that's what you want, or simply raise your hand in the raise hand function, and I can call on you and you can unmute and ask your questions in the old-fashioned pre-pandemic way, which might be a little bit more friendly. But it's really my pleasure to introduce a wonderful colleague and a wonderful academic, Professor Jefferson-Jones. Professor Jamila Jefferson-Jones writes about property and wealth attainment by communities and groups on the margins of society. She examines the way members of favored racialized groups exclude minoritized populations from public and private spaces, thus enforcing the racial segregation of space and racist notions of supremacy. Her work harnesses critical race methodologies, focusing on the use of threat of police action against members of disfavored groups. Her most recent article on this subject, hashtag Living While Black, Blackness as Nuisance, was published in the American University Law Review and featured in the New York Times. Jefferson-Jones is a professor of law and also an associate director of property, equity, and justice at the Damon J. Keith Center for Civil Rights. Before joining Wayne Law, she was on the school faculty of the University of Missouri, Kansas City. She teaches courses in property, real estate transactions, fair housing, and entrepreneurial urban development. Professor Jefferson-Jones is a graduate of Harvard Law School and Harvard College. Prior to entering academia, she practiced for over a decade at firms in the District of Columbia and her hometown of New Orleans. We look forward to the discussion on living while Black in the racialization space. I give you Wayne Law Professor Jamila Jefferson-Jones.
Hi there, and thank you so much for that generous introduction, Professor Hammer. If you all will just bear with me for 1 second, I am fighting with technology. And my notes just decided to disappear on me, so it'll take 1 second to pull those back up. They should be right there. All righty, there we go. Okay, great. Okay, so as was just said, I will be talking to you all today about living while Black and the racialization of space. And so I have some slides I'd like to share with you to try to parse out what it is that I'm talking about and what I mean by this. So let's go ahead and share those slides, and then we can get on into it. Okay. Righty. All right, should be good to go. Unfortunately, now I can't see you all, but hopefully you're seeing the slides. If you are not, someone please let me know, but we will go ahead and go forward here. So the talk is entitled, as we have there, Living While Black and the Racialization of Space. And this term, living while Black, covers a strand in my research that, as Professor Hammer mentioned, engages critical race methodologies to interrogate the ways in which those that have been racialized as white seek to exclude those who have been racialized as Black from public and private spaces, and particularly through the use or threat of state violence perpetuated by police action. He mentioned one of my recent pieces which was written in 2020 with Professor Tajania Henderson of Rutgers, and it's entitled #Living While Black, Blackness as Nuisance, published in the American Law Review. And I think we may be able to supply you all with the slides, and you'll have the hyperlink to this, to the article there in the American Law Review. But there's also a second piece, a follow-up that I wrote the next year, entitled Driving While Black as Living While Black, which was published in the Iowa Law Review, and also deals with some of those same themes. And hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that in that context. But in the first piece, Professor Henderson and I examined a slew of 2018 and 2019 incidents in which white people called the police on Black people who were engaged in everyday activities. And while most commentators saw these incidents as criminal justice issues, which we also saw the property issue happening here. So in our article, we worked to bridge the gap between criminal law and property law by examining how these complaints in what we called Living While Black incidents deploy the language of land use, particularly trespass and nuisance, to provoke state violence, with the aim of excluding Black people from what ought to be shared spaces. So first of all, what do we mean by the racialization of space, or another term is racial territoriality, which was a term that was coined by Professor Elise Badi, who coincidentally is also at Rutgers, where Professor Henderson teaches. But property is racialized when it is ascribed a racial identity or character that excludes some and includes others on the basis of race. And those spaces can be neighborhoods, they can be public parks, they can be avenues, boulevards, streets, country roads, interstates. Spaces are racialized by the people who use and lay claim to them. And the central principle of racial territoriality or racialization of space is that what should be shared space is wrongfully claimed in the name of racist exclusion and in the interest of white supremacy. So another question is, well, what does living while Black mean? What is living while Black? What does that term mean? If we go back to 2018, there's a list that CNN put out in December of 2018, and they reported on the times in which the police had been called on Black folk that year, up until almost the end of the year. And so in their list, they said that Black people had had the police called on them for operating a lemonade store, golfing too slowly, waiting for a friend at Starbucks, barbecuing at a park, working out at a gym, campaigning door to door, moving into an apartment, mowing the wrong lawn, shopping for prom clothes, napping in a university common room, asking for directions, not waving while leaving an Airbnb, redeeming a coupon, selling bottled water on a sidewalk, eating lunch on a college campus, riding in a car with a white grandmother, babysitting 2 white children, wearing a backpack that brushed against a woman, working as a home inspector, working as a firefighter, helping a homeless man, delivering newspapers, swimming in a pool, shopping while pregnant, driving with leaves on a car, trying to cash a paycheck. So walking while Black, driving while Black, swimming while Black, studying while Black, hanging out in a cafe or Starbucks while Black, all of these things, doing all of these things and having the police called to remove you from the space in which you are merely existing. That is what we mean by living while Black. And by modest estimates, the term living while Black has been used on social media to describe these experiences hundreds of thousands, if not millions of times. And since the 2018 Starbucks incident, which I will talk about in a minute, which happened in Philadelphia, we've been researching this phenomenon and seeking answers for such questions as whose rights and which of those rights ought the law and law enforcement seek to protect in these living while Black incidents, and what remedies ought to be available to those whose rights are violated. So when we were looking at these incidents and looking at the social media hashtag, one thing that was important to note is that this hashtag living while Black, or this term living while Black, is actually a play on an older term, driving while Black. And so as I mentioned to you, the next year I wrote about driving while Black. And it's interesting because although driving while Black can be considered a sub category of living while Black, driving while Black also predates living while Black. So it's really an interesting interplay there. But driving while Black is a euphemism that is used to describe the violence of racial profiling of Black drivers by law enforcement. Living while Black itself first appeared as a social media hashtag to mobilize attention to incidents in which white people called the police on Black people for engaging in non-criminal everyday activities. And while this term living while Black had been used previously to describe the fraught conditions of navigating racist encounters for Black people, the hashtag, through the use of this high quality cell phone video and the use of social media, brought the term into the nation's common lexicon. So we started out our article with this statement: in 2018, the powerful combination of high quality cell phone video and social media brought to light a barrage of incidents involving 911 calls reporting that Black people were occupying spaces that the callers believed they ought not occupy. So again, here we see that racialization of space, because we have the white callers making the decision about where Black bodies ought to be. And in nearly all of these cases, the targeted men, women, and children were in places in which they had a legal right to be and engaging in activities in which they had a legal right to engage. So this was widely circulated and debated on social media. These incidents went viral, and they spawned a series of social media hashtags, the most striking of which is living while Black, our hashtag living while Black. And what's different about this modern rise in living while Black incidents is that cell phone technology has put high quality video production and distribution in the hands of the masses. Everyone is a video producer now. Everyone is able to use this ostensibly objective medium to validate their witness to abuses, whether to the circumstances prompting false 911 calls or to police violence. And the ubiquity of the cell phones does not make it easier. While it does make it easier, for racists to call the police quickly, one thing that we noted is that that ease of abuse, of police call abuse, may be outweighed by the benefits that victims and bystanders are able to reap. So cell phone video corroborates what had previously been dismissed as unreliable or merely anecdotal. So what's not different, however, from earlier eras is the policing of Black people within public and private spaces and the use of law enforcement as a tool of racist exclusion. And so again, I just have a picture there of the police marching by, and this idea of police as a tool to exclude Black people from spaces in which they have the right to be. So I want to turn to the Starbucks incident for a moment. This incident took place in April of 2018 in a Starbucks in Philadelphia. And you all may remember that 2 Black men were arrested in Starbucks. The reason that was given was that they weren't buying anything. However, that's not something that's required in Starbucks. The Philadelphia police claim not to have known that. Starbucks bills itself as a third place, neither public nor private. And of course, we think of it as a cafe, as a store. But what Starbucks invites its patrons to do is to come in and use it as their living room. I've seen people who are in sales come in and spend their day making cold calls from there, sometimes buying a cup of coffee, sometimes not. Starbucks does not really care if you bring in a little bit of food of your own. They figure that eventually you will buy from them. They provide you with Wi-Fi. They are set up for you to stay for a while. And there are a number of business meetings that take place in Starbucks. And that's what these two African-American gentlemen were looking to do, is to have a business meeting. So the first guy gets there, sits down, he's waiting for his friend. They were going to discuss a business opportunity. And before they could get going, the manager asked them to leave. She used a pretextual reason that they weren't buying anything, but the manager, who was a white woman, seemed to be bothered by their presence there, threatened by their presence there. And so this video that I'm going to show very quickly, and in fact, what I will do for just 1 second is stop the share and then go back into the share so that we can make sure that you are able to hear this as well as possible. Just 1 second. We had worked this out. And now I've lost that ability, but it's important. There we go. Okay, it's all checked off. Important that you're able to hear. What you'll hear in the background, and one of the things that's a theme throughout these incidents, is that you have white bystanders who are often the filmers, who do speak out. And in a lot of these incidents, they are the ones documenting because they are in a position to do so without facing some of the violent police repercussions. But I want you to listen for what the bystanders are saying, and also just kind of watch what's happening here.
Don't get no fight with them. Don't get no fight with them. Yeah, I mean, it's ridiculous. Yeah, it's ridiculous. What did they get called for? Because there are two black guys sitting here meeting me? Yes. Well, what did they do? What did they do? Did someone tell me what they did?
They didn't do anything. I saw the entire thing.
They didn't. What did they do?
Nothing. The woman says for paying customers and after they didn't do anything.
Alrighty, so we see there white folk milling around. I don't know what just happened there. Let's fix that. White folk milling around with their Starbucks or not, and with their laptops, and also protesting. Okay, we've gotten kind of lost in the sauce here. Let's get this the right way. Protesting the treatment of these African-American patrons, and you hear them saying, what did they do? They didn't do anything wrong. And you hear a woman in the background saying those same things. But the idea here is that the white folk in the place were allowed to just be there in whichever way they felt necessary, while the Black patrons had additional requirements put on them and were not free to be in this third space. So that was the incident that really kicked off in 2018 a number of incidents that we noticed and documented. Let's just, okay, here we go. Now, I mentioned that this, though, is not new, this idea of living while Black. So I want to, or that Black presence is a nuisance. So I want to just take a moment and talk about Blackness as nuisance from a historical perspective, because what we found was that in a number of these incidents that we documented, the white antagonists were using the language of trespass and nuisance when they called the police to have Black people excluded from these spaces. So although the moniker might be a little new, as in this dissemination of hashtags via cell phone footage and social media, the idea or the clashes with Blackness as nuisance themselves are not new. And in fact, these sorts of clashes and encounters between and among Black and non-Black neighbors have been the subject of civil litigation. A lot of this litigation commenced in the years following Reconstruction, and what we saw was white litigants beginning to pursue property law claims that sounded in nuisance in an attempt to police and arrest Black proximity. So we see in these earlier years an effort by white litigants to cast Black people and their nearness as property harms deserving of legal protection. And what we see, interestingly enough, is that in each of these cases, even while courts frequently accepted as valid the social undesirability of Black proximity, that presumptive undesirability did not result in the granting of a remedy at law. So even as these Jim Crow era judges admitted racial bias and struggled to reconcile their personal social preferences with the ostensibly race-neutral common law of nuisance, in decision after decision, we see judges rejecting claims for property relief. One of the oldest cases that we found was one from 1883. The facts underlying it began in 1882, where James Falloon, an attorney in Hiawatha, Kansas, brought suit against his neighbor, Adam Schilling, claiming that Schilling's construction of tenement houses along the lot line that they shared was a nuisance solely because the tenants were Black. In a clear nod to the social construction of whiteness, Falloon included in his pleading that he and his family, quote, did in no manner associate themselves with colored people, he and his family being white people. According to the court, the allegation that Schilling leased the tenements to persons the plaintiff termed worthless Negroes was unavailing in this nuisance action for two reasons. The first was because the court uncritically noted that the tenants included a minister and his family and therefore were not worthless Negroes. And then second, the court noted that a Negro family per se is not per se a nuisance. As long as the neighbor's family is well behaved, it matters not what the color, race, or habits may be, or how offensive personally or socially it may be to plaintiff. Plaintiff has no cause of complaint in the courts. So we can see that while the social media and public conversation phenomenon that we've been examining, or that I've examined in various ways, it emerged, over the last few years, but racial territoriality is not new. And these ideas date back as far as the founding of the country, and racial lines were hardened during the Jim Crow era. Emancipation, as noted by scholars, including W.E.B. Du Bois, did not lead to freedom. And we see that here, where there's this policing of Black proximity. Now I want to fast forward, and this is going to be a quick clip from Lovecraft Country, which some of you may have watched a year or so ago. This is both crosses the genres of horror and Afrofuturism. This was on HBO. And in this particular scene, this scene takes place in Chicago. And one of the protagonists, Letty has bought a home, a large home in what had been or what is a white neighborhood. And she's looking for an opportunity to stake out a claim to some land and some real estate to bring her friends and family together to live together. And what she encounters, though, is resistance from the white neighbors. And also what we see here is that these white neighbors are able to evoke police support and an underlying threat of police violence, of state-sanctioned violence. You'll hear Trumbull Park mentioned here, where there was a riot in another part of Chicago, and a Black family was run out of a white neighborhood that they had moved into. So listen here to how this scene is set up, and also to this watch for the police threat that is visited upon these new Black residents.
Here we go. I told you it was going to be Trumbull Park all over again.
Maybe I will stick around a little longer.
So here we see this theme of harassment, of staking out of claims to property as racial territory here, white racial territory, as the Black homeowner, because she is a legitimate homeowner, someone who has purchased this property legitimately and has a right to be there. Yet she's not able to avail herself of police protection in enforcing her property rights, but instead is shown in this scene that the police will not help her. And we see that kind of sneer that one of the white antagonists makes when he looks over at the police, and basically his look says, they are on our side and you'll have no recourse here. So that is part of what we were talking about with regard to this idea of racial territoriality. Okay, we're going to go forward here. So if we now kind of jump forward into the summer of 2018, with all of this background and these ideas, we get to two of the most notorious of the Living While Black incidents of 2018. One occurred in Oakland, California, along the shores of the city's Lake Merritt. And we see in both the April incident at Lake Merritt and then a subsequent incident, the leveraging by white women, and I told you that that's also what was happening in Starbucks specifically, of racist tropes around Black predation and violence and white female vulnerability. This was also a theme that played through in these Living While Black incidents. So not just the idea that Black people ought to be excluded, but often an idea that Black men should be excluded, and that part of what was happening is that this was for the protection of white women. So that's another theme that we explored. But in both of these cases, the women used the mechanism of 911 emergency services to craft narratives of victimhood and heroism in the face of threats to an imagined public. We have Dr. Schulte with the sunglasses on. She initially called 911, saying that these Black men were barbecuing in the park, and that there might be some wayward coals that might cause harm to children. She then later called back when that did not work and claimed that she was being threatened. The other woman here who gained the sobriquet Permit Patty called the police on a Black child who was selling water on the sidewalk outside of what was shared space for them. So not only is the sidewalk shared space, but it was in front of the apartment home in which they both lived. And she, again, used this idea that she was trying to protect the legal regime because this little girl was selling water without a permit. So with the woman who gained the name Barbecue Becky, when she was initially confronted about her choice to call the Oakland police to report on these men, she displayed this steadfastness in the face of her critics, refusing to yield or end her call. And then seconds later, when connected with 911 dispatch, she began to cry and to claim to have been harassed. And then once they got there, she made a scene saying that and acted as if she was unable even to communicate with the police. Though there were witnesses and there's video and audio with her saying, "Y'all are going to jail." It was only after they did not yield to her her claims of territory of supremacy in this space that she then claimed that she was being harassed by them and tried to flip the tables there. Now I'm putting up this other slide, going back to the former president, because this also speaks to this idea of certain territory here, neighborhoods, as being white neighborhoods or places that white people have the right to. Now you see that that word isn't there though, right? Instead, we get this term suburban, which has been a dog whistle for white, low income as a dog whistle for Black and brown people. So we have here this tweet back when Donald Trump was still allowed on Twitter, saying, "I'm happy to inform all of the people living their suburban lifestyle dream," so one that does not include Black folk, "that you will no longer be bothered," so we have that theme of nuisance, "or financially hurt by having low-income housing built in your neighborhood. Your housing prices will go up based on the market and crime will go down. I have rescinded the Obama-Biden AFFH just lost my affirmatively furthering fair housing rule." That's what that stands for. And then later we get this: "The suburban housewife will be voting for me." Again, an appeal to white womanhood. "They want safety and are thrilled that I have ended the long-running program where low-income housing would invade their neighborhood." So again, this idea of invasion by Black and brown people. So they won't invade their neighborhood. Biden would reinstall it. And of course, Biden being a proxy for the former Black president in a bigger form with Cory Booker, now the new Black boogeyman, in charge. So again, we get these themes of protection of whiteness, with white women as the standard bearer for those who need protection. This idea of a Black male boogeyman in Obama and Booker, and even Biden, though a white man, as proxy for them. And this idea again of invasion of Black people being out of place, of them being in these white spaces. Now, I've said that I would talk a little bit about driving while Black. And so we can ask this question, well, what is that, right? What is driving while Black. This is something that I explore in my most recent piece, and I explore it as both a predecessor and a subgenre of living while Black. And so in driving while Black, I also note that these incidents, these driving while Black incidents, can be analyzed as using property law rather than solely using criminal justice. And in a way, so this is an expansion of the living while Black scope, and it plays into this perpetuation of white supremacy, Black subordination, and particularly as they function in spatial contexts. So in this case, as they affect Black people's freedom of movement and the right to use and enjoy the open road. And the open road has been this symbol of American freedom, right? We talk about getting in our cars and driving from place to place. And even if we go back to the founding of the country, this idea of free movement to these new lands, and then we can then hook in the idea of manifest destiny and just kind of moving across the continent. But that this freedom of movement is one of the hallmarks of American liberty. However, that has largely been a white privilege. Throughout the history of the United States, Black people, whether enslaved or free, have faced both de jure and de facto limitations on their ability to move about freely. So moreover, as in the case with the larger living while Black genre, restrictions on Black movement have long been enforced through the use of police force. We can go back and look at the era of slavery in the United States, where travel by both enslaved and free Blacks was severely circumscribed. Enslaved Blacks were only permitted to travel away from the plantations on which they were held captive with permission manifested by written passes signed by their owners. The law also required free Blacks to carry papers evidencing their free status in order to safely travel the country's roads. And such papers, in theory, would not only permit them to travel, but would protect them from being thrust back or thrust into enslavement. And it's important to tie to make the tie between slave patrols and police force. So slave patrols historians have noted that these are the ancestors, of the modern day police force. They were the means by which the rules of Black movement were enforced. So again, the rules of Black bodies in spaces, right? So not only could members of slave patrols discipline enslaved persons who had left their plantations without permission, they had the authority to kill those who resisted. Thus, the constriction of the movement of Black people who were either property or at peril of becoming property was inextricably tied to property rights, which were enforced through state-sanctioned violence. So therefore, we can go back to Professor Elise Body, who I mentioned before when we talked about racial territoriality. She noted that whites' ability to exclude, marginalize, and confine slaves and even free Blacks was premised on the property rights and backed by the power of the state. So we see all of these things being tied together with regard to what constitutes, what spaces are available to non-white people, particularly Black people, who polices those spaces, who has the right to enforce the racial notions tied to space, and how that impacts Black freedom and thriving in this country. And so I want to then flash forward to May 25th of 2020 and that moment of racial reckoning with George Floyd, and remind you that on that same day, there was a confrontation between a white woman who was a dog walker in Central Park and a Black man who was a bird watcher in that same space. He sought to enforce his rights in that space, which was to be able to watch the birds without unleashed dogs in the area, because there were a number of ground nesting birds in that area. When he then told her, reminded her of the leash law for that part of the park, rather than complying, she chose to call the police and say that he was harassing her, that he was threatening her. And before she did so, she told him that that's what she was going to do. I'm going to call the police and tell them that an African-American man is threatening me in the park. He, of course, was not doing that. He has video of it that was also posted and went viral. And she had some consequences that she had to deal with. But what's important to note is that in doing so, in making this call, she put him at peril. This could have been escalated by police, and he could have ended up in the same position that we see George Floyd ending up in 2020. This is always a risk when the police are called, that there will be escalation. Data shows that that risk of escalation is higher when the person having the police called on them is Black, and particularly when that person is a Black male. So it's these calls that are made to 911 are not without risk to Black life. And so it's important to note that this idea of territoriality, this use of police action to enforce it, has an impact not just on Black living, but on Black lives and their very existence. So that's part and parcel of what I've been working on. And Professor Henderson and I are now working on a book, which is right now entitled Black Lives, White Property. And we're going to see where we go with that. And one of the fundamental questions that we're asking or that we're dealing with is this idea that Black lives are often in peril when white property is being protected. So again, thank you for listening to me, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Great. So thank you so much, Professor Jefferson-Jones. I'm going to remind our guests and alumni that you can put questions in the chat if you like. If you'd rather use the raise hand function, you can do that, and our behind the scenes tech gurus will unmute you. But I have a few questions that I want to get us started with. And then obviously welcome the viewers to be asking questions as well. One is to kind of think about this longitudinally. You know, you've shown how long history this practice has. And then we also know that we have cell phones, so that it's easier to document. So the kind of conundrum is, are these things happening more now than they were 5 years ago, 10 years ago, 15 years ago? Or are we just getting better documentation of the phenomena?
So I think the answer is two-part. One, yes, we're getting better documentation, right? Because Black people have been talking about this forever. But now there's proof, and proof that seems objective, right? You've got the video. Now, of course, we've had video of police brutality in the past. We've had other video. We can think back to Rodney King, but that was grainy and we couldn't really hear what was going on. And somebody was shooting with a video camera from their apartment window. Well, now we're up close and personal. It's clear, there's sound. And so I think one is that we have better evidence. Now, are we having more incidents? I think that, and this is my gut reaction, that during the Trump era, there was more boldness with regard to people staking claims to space. But I don't have the hard evidence on. So that's one I'd like to kind of try to figure out. But I do know that for 2018, it was in the news every moment. And I gave you that list from that CNN put out there in December of 2018, and it just seemed to be happening over and over. And we talk about a number of them in the paper. There were so many more that we couldn't even put in there. We have a large spreadsheet and database on all of these incidents. where Black people had the police called on them for simply doing regular things.
Yeah, no, and my intuitions are similar to yours, which is kind of a presupposition of the question, which would then lead, obviously it's speculation, but if we're assuming this is happening more, and one thing that would bolster my confidence in that kind of assumption is we've had recorded 911 calls for a long time. All right, so you're right, we didn't have quite the visuality, but we had the potential to document and record. But if these are happening more frequently, the question really is why? And I like your kind of language of staking out, right? Again, sort of using that property climb in reference of being more defensive of territory and feeling oneself almost as deputized, right? In ways that they can privately enforce. But I know I'm asking you to speculate, and if you don't want to, that's fine. But if you want to kind of share some of your intuitions about why this is happening in the form that we're seeing it and the rapidity of the CNN of reports, what are you thinking?
So, one thing that happens is where there are moments of Black progress, you get these moments of, they're followed by backlash, right? That's the cycle. So that's the cycle that of Reconstruction and redemption. That's the cycle of the institution of Jim Crow. And that's the cycle that you see, the post-Obama cycle. So I think that this is a post-Obama reaction, the pinnacle of which was the election of Donald Trump. And so I think that if I had to try to pinpoint it, that would be it. We see in the anti-CRT backlash that started as a reaction to the moment of racial reckoning that started on May 25th, 2020. You did not see any, CRT is, 50 years old, as old as I am. And yet we weren't hearing anything about it until there was this backlash to what seemed like a moment of racial progress.
Right. So we have a comment in the chat, and I would actually invite Chuck, if you would, because I think there's more context here than just the typing would demonstrate. But if you're willing, Chuck, if you kind of be unmuted and share your thinking behind the questions, I think there's some interesting content here.
Sure. As you, first of all, thank you very much. Really interesting, Professor Jefferson-Jones. The last comment that I made as you were talking about this sort of interesting conundrum between are we measuring it better and how do we know? I just made a comment that problem comes up in the autism literature. And so, for example, once the federal government under IDEA started funding people differently based on whether you got an autism diagnosis or you got some other diagnosis, the prevalence changed. And you got this same sort of problem where it was all over the news and people had to try to figure out what's real and how do I measure it so that I can actually improve it. So that might be a place that you could look. It's a similar problem, a different problem, but the sort of statistical sophistication that medical researchers use can be applied in legal thinking also, right? Yeah. And we all know the documentation needs to improve. I mean, nobody can even agree about what's the right database of incidents, right? So, anyway, that was the comment, I think. Is that the one that you meant, Peter, or?
Yes, indeed. I thought that was an interesting insight. And Jamila, thoughts that might trigger in your head?
I think that's interesting. And I'm thinking about it because we have issues of specific learning disabilities in my family. And I've always wondered with regard to, and some autism in my extended family, is it that there are more people or with this diagnosis? Or is it that we're just more aware of it and therefore have better tools of measuring it? So I think it might be interesting to look at medical research and the ways that they deal with statistical analysis from that standpoint. And it makes me think about also those who study the public health folk who study violence. So I would like to delve into their measurements with regard to that also. So all of that seems interesting. But yeah, it is hard to pinpoint, is it that we have more or is it just that we have better tools for measuring?
Well, and it might be like Schrodinger's cat. I mean, you'll never get the answer, right? But anyway, Okay.
Great. Thank you, Chuck. Um, um, I want to sort of lean into your expertise on property, right? So, you're using a property lens to look at things that some others might be using other lens. So what do we see differently, right? And what do we learn specifically from a property lens that we might have missed if we never did look at it through that perspective?
Right. I think we missed when we were only thinking about this with the criminal justice lens, we were missing locus, right? We were missing where it happened and what that had to do with race. So all of the criminal justice people knew this was a race problem and this was a race and policing problem. But I don't think it was answering the why. And the why is because these Black folk were out of place, right? They weren't going to have this treatment at some coffee shop that had been opened up in a Black neighborhood. This was because this space was white space and they weren't supposed to be there. And if you look at the guys in the Starbucks incident, they were youngish, they were in athletic wear, they, maybe things would have been different if they were dressed differently or if they were a little older. But you put all those things together and this lady, this woman, the manager, identifies them as out of place and as threatening, although they were doing exactly what everyone else there was doing. Sitting, waiting for a friend to show up. Maybe I'll buy coffee, maybe I won't. Maybe I'll use your restroom, maybe I won't. All the things that we do there. But I think focusing on property and noticing that these people are using this nuisance language and this trespass language helps us to understand where these things happen, which gets us to the why, even if we go forward. And so I used George Floyd, and you could say, well, but that was a possible criminal infraction, might have been passing a bad $20 bill. Of course, we know that the punishment for that is not death. But if we look even with that at where it happened, Cup Foods is on the kind of the border of Black and white neighborhood. And so those areas we find are policed more heavily. Those borders are policed more heavily than other areas. And so even there, if we look at locality, if we look at space, we see that he was too close to being out of space. He was bordering on that, and that area, that border had to be policed and was policed more heavily. And what happens in those borders is that people who are out of place, Black people who are out of place, are punished more harshly.
I love those insights. And as you know, at the Key Center, we talk about the racialization of space, the spatialization of race, draw particular attention to notions of spatial racism, and the geography is essential. And I love how your work draws attention to that. I would share out with some of our alumni who are watching some of the changes that have happened in our own orientation that try to raise some of these issues. So as you said, part of it is when people go into white space and how vulnerable they are. The other part is you're recognizing is all the containment efforts, right? To keep folks contained in particular neighborhoods, including the notion of neighborhood associations that are using private vigilante violence to enforce those. Mm-hmm. And obviously one of the most notorious incidents of that in Detroit was Dr. Austin Sweets. And Kevin Boyle's wonderful book, The Arc of Justice, tells that story. And for the last 3 years, as part of orientation, we've made that summer reading requirement, right? So students start to learn the history of Detroit, understand those dynamics, and come with that literacy, right? Prepared to be thinking about these issues to Wayne Law when they come to their first year, right? And I see your work is really a nice extension of that kind of tradition. But Zen has a wonderful question, and I love the pragmatism of it. We've diagnosed it, you've documented it, and Zen is asking, how do we correct/challenge it? How do we respond to these issues?
So that's the conundrum, right? So there have been some modest efforts, Karen Acts, as they've been called, which punish people for making these racialized 911 calls. The problem is that the punishment isn't so great. I don't know that it's enough to be a deterrent. And I don't even know if their existence would be deterrent enough, because a lot of this is kind of lizard brain reaction, right? People who see blackness as threat and therefore call. One of the things that I liked, I don't know how many of you all are familiar with the Neighborhood app, or that's what it's called, Neighborhood. And at one point, people were on there making reports of suspicious, there's a suspicious person in the neighborhood. Well, it turned out that suspicious was like almost always Black. And so what they did was they changed their reporting. They made it so that you had to explain what was suspicious about this person. Are they walking around checking car doors, or are they just walking? Right? And if you weren't able to explain what was happening there, you weren't able to finish your report, which means you weren't able to then cause this person to be harassed. So sometimes the answer is in the technology. Sometimes the answer is in training of 911 dispatchers. So in the Barbecue Becky instance, if you listen to the audio of the 911 call, it's really great, because the dispatcher, who to me sounds like she might have been a Black woman, says, so what are they doing? Well, okay, but exactly, she asks a lot of questions. And at one point she asks about race, and Schulte says, well, that has nothing to do with it. And she says, well, actually, ma'am, it does, because if I'm sending the police, I need to give descriptions. So Schulte doesn't want to tell her race, or she did tell the race of the men, but she wanted to then say, well, no, race has nothing to do with it. But a lot of questions were asked. And so when the policeman arrived there, he had already been told by the dispatcher that this woman does not seem to be on the up and up. Watch out for her, keep your eyes open. I don't think this is real. So he went in there not thinking that she was the victim, but instead with his eyes open. And so he diffused the situation. But that was because the dispatcher asked a lot of good questions and was able to figure out that something wasn't quite right there.
Those are all great suggestions. We're coming to the end of our time. We could talk about this for hours, and you and I will. So our conversation will continue, but I'm glad we had a chance to share with some of our alumni. I laughed when you talked about the reptile brain, because another space we have to be looking for racism is where it's happening in the brain, right? In terms of moral psychology, social psychology. And I really think that's got to be something that is central to our further discussion of how we're going to be dealing with race and racism. And good work has already started. I don't want to suggest that it's not there, but I really think that that's a place, right? And a space where we also have to be examining these issues. But I want to thank everybody who has been here. I want to thank in particular our presenter, Professor Jamila Jefferson-Jones. But I want to give a special thanks to our alumni. I mean, this whole legal brief series is an honor of you, and creating community and relationships with Wayne State Law, getting to know the amazing professors who are here teaching our students and preparing them to deal with these important issues in the future. So we'll sign off by saying thank you. And wishing you all a very wonderful evening, but have a wonderful night.
Thank you.